Hello. I have some thoughts I was wanting to share. Um, I was in a conversation with some friends about manifestation type magic or law of attraction stuff. And the conversation, as it often does, went into the area of to what extent is that a distraction on the spiritual path? Manifesting health, manifesting success, money, things like that. Um, I want to quote Damien Eccles, who has said repeatedly, and I agree with this um, poverty is not a virtue. Poverty is not virtuous in and of itself. And the line in the Bible um, that is, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into heaven, does have something to do with wealth and with success. The more you have to lose, I've heard of people. I know people whose spiritual teachers refuse to teach in Boulder, Colorado because people are too rich. People are too comfortable. They have too much to lose. And so their spirituality becomes more about just staying comfortable. Um, and I think that that's often the case. The more money, more problems. It becomes a distraction to the extent that um, that for some people, identification with success, that's how their ego manifests. They're identified with being successful. I myself am incredibly identified, on the other hand, with failure. I've been identified with misery, with sickness, with insanity. Um, and so my ego actually naturally gravitates. I tried to drink myself to death before the age of 22, um, and almost succeeded, and thought that that was a poetic and tragic thing. I was obsessed with tragedy. That's also something that I noticed. I don't think I'm alone in that, having been a part of the slam poetry community for a long time. I noticed the tendency uh, to elevate the tragic, to elevate the dysfunction and trauma and everything that is wrong in the world. Um, Not that those things don't need to be discussed, they do. You have to know what the problem is in order to solve it. Um, but I was thinking afterwards. Well, part of the conversation went into Haxrat Inayat Khan, who brought Sufism to the West, talked about the path of the master and the path of the saint. The path of the saint is in a state of absolute and total surrender to all things. The path of the saint is to be only a glove for the hand of God. Whatever comes, you deal with. My cat is now present, uh, and I think that that is a noble path. The path of surrendering to circumstance. If you get sick, then you get sick. If you die, you die. Ultimately, your orientation is only to God. You are God asking in prayer. You are God asking God through God for more God, and that is the entirety of your path. And there is also the path of the master. The path of the master is to be in struggle throughout your life. Um, the calm serenity that the saint enjoys likely does not come to the master. The path of the master is, for example, while Damien Eccles manifesting his freedom from, uh, death row and solitary confinement. If he had chosen the path of the saint, he would have died and no one would have heard his teachings. The path of the master is also, during World War II, Syrian Jews saw the Nazis encroaching across northern Africa. The Northern African campaign was seemingly unstoppable. And they saw the Nazis getting closer and closer to Syria. And so the more, Orthodox Jewish people went to the Kabbalists, the masters, and said, not that there aren't Kabbalists who are on the path of the saint, but and they said, can you do something? Can you save us? And so they said, we'll see what we can do. They went away for a few days and they came back and they said that they had gone into, the inner plane or whatever. And in Hebrew, the letters for Syria and the letters for Russia, the spelling is the same letters. And so what they did on the inner plane is they rearranged the letters Syria to spell Russia. And what happened is that the shortly after that, the Nazis went to war against Russia, and that led to their defeat. And the Nazis never stepped foot in Syria, and the Syrian Jews were saved. And that's not to say that one is better than the other. Haxrat Inayat Khan talks about the ideal of the prophet, which doesn't mean that you're a prophet or I'm a prophet or anything like that, but the prophet is the ideal, and that is the union of both paths, both the path of the saint and the path of the master, the path of surrender and the path of power. I was afterward contemplating that and thinking about how if you pursue anything is a gateway to the divine. If you pursue absolutely anything with 100%, 1,000% sincerity and devotion, it can lead you to the goal, whatever that may be, whatever you want to call that, realization, enlightenment, sainthood in a more general sense. And the poet Baudelaire is an example. So is Austin Osman Spare, the inventor of chaos sigils, as they're now known, and sigil magic. There are examples, particularly within, or at least I'm most familiar with them within Western esotericism, of people who have pursued debauchery into the gates of realization. They encountered what the Sufis might call the tavern of ruin. They lost everything. Many of Baudelaire included, many of them died young. They devoted themselves to self-destruction. And I'm not recommending this. I'm just saying that they devoted themselves to self-destruction so wholly and so completely that it led them to wholeness. It led them to God and to unity. For the most part, people don't do this. For example, as devoted and as interested and involved and identified with tragedy and self-destruction as I was before getting sober and at points afterwards, I wasn't 100%. I wasn't devoted. I'm not suggesting that anyone watching this become devoted to self-destruction. I'm merely suggesting that even within Sufism, there's some orders that are more influenced by Buddhist thought, particularly in Afghanistan. And for them, God is al-Haq, or the truth. And if you pursue the truth with total sincerity and devotion, it can lead you to the goal. And then other Sufi orders are more interested or more identified with invoking God as the beloved. Al-Mabud, I think. Uh, and that has consequences for your path and your experience on the path. Because if you pursue God as truth, then you better never tell a lie. You better pursue that with absolute sincerity, pursue authenticity and truth in every aspect of your being. If you pursue God, if you invoke God as the judge, as Christianity often does, that has consequences for your experience on the path. A judge looks at a defendant in a court case much differently than the beloved looks at the lover. If you invoke and pursue God as the mother looks differently at the child than the judge looks at the defendant. One of the only sort of traditions, established lineage traditions that I know of that have this orientation towards pursuing misery as a path to the divine is the Celtic tradition. The Bardic tradition is full of old poetry. And at this point now, every poet wants to talk about being depressed. But at that point, like, spiritual poetry in most cultures was not oriented towards sadness. It wasn't oriented towards grief and despair. And so there is somewhat of a unique quality, especially comparing Sufi poetry, not that it doesn't include pain, but comparing Sufi poetry, for example, to Bardic poetry. Bardic poetry has this quality of grief, of just absolute heartbroken, melancholic despair. And they likely had a container because the tradition has that as part of it. So they have a stabilizing container for people to be able to actually pursue and fully experience, in the same way that you can pursue and fully experience love, and have that be sort of a purifying fire that moves through you and guides your life and guides you towards the goal. Melancholy, misery can also be that. Again, not recommending this. I don't believe that this is my path. But I think it's a spicy and maybe important idea that everything is a gateway to God. If you go deep enough into anything, you find the mystery. And so theoretically, you could pursue money into the gates of realization. I think that it's incredibly difficult for a number of reasons. And one of them, going back to talking about pursuing tragedy or pursuing despair or melancholy, I think that most people who experience extreme despair, depression, melancholy, things like that, have a sense of wanting things to get better. When I was an alcoholic, even as identified as I was with being the tragic, self-destructive drunk, part of me wanted out. And I think that's almost always the case. Baudelaire pursued it with total sincerity and arguably attained the goal. I think that that's rare. I think it's also rare for people to pursue things outside of the context of a tradition. New Age people rarely have spiritual teachers. They don't want to be told anything. They want to do whatever they want to do. Maybe full offense intended. And I think that, for example, theoretically, you could just go into a cave and have no tradition, no teachings, no teacher, no, saints that you have as like, oh, this is a person who's really done it and I'm going to do what they did. And you could spend 40 years meditating in a cave and you could achieve the goal. But the reason that I think that mostly doesn't work for people is that you don't have the faith required for total, sincere devotion. You can't do it 100% in the same way that you can when you see this worked for someone else. I have this teacher, I have these saints of this tradition, I have all these teachings, and these teachings have been uh, leading people to the goal successfully for thousands of years. If you don't have that, it is nearly impossible to pursue anything with total sincerity. I think that because there's part of you that's like, is this going to do anything? I don't know. Um, and so, for whatever reason, this felt like an important thing to put out into the cosmos. Um, I also want to add that my work with and within the Celtic tradition, my understanding of the red and the white dragon, if you're involved in the Celtic tradition, you likely are familiar with this. Um, the red dragon, the red and the white dragon relate to Beltana, May 1st, and Samhain, uh, or Halloween, October 31st. And those energies, it relates to, the red dragon is love. The red dragon is vitality, of spring, of, your heart opening, that kind of like fire, that warmth. Where the white dragon, Halloween, all the ghosts of the dead coming and walking the earth, um and the descent into winter. The Celtic tradition was working with melancholy in the same way that Sufis work um, with love, in the same way that Buddhists work with truth. The Celts were working with melancholy, with sorrow. There's a famous quote, I don't know where this comes from, but uh, the, something along the lines of the Irish, the men whom God made mad for all their wars are merry and all their songs are sad. All their songs being sad is referential to this. And so I think in closing, and I hope this sparks something in someone, who knows, um, pursuing anything with absolute sincerity, as long as you're not doing, okay, I'm going to do a little bit of this and a little bit of this and a little bit, like, as long as you do just one thing, and obviously you course correct. You're never, as Nathaniel, my teacher, says, if you're a ship, if you're the driving, piloting a ship from point A to point B across an ocean, only 5% of the time are you actually in that straight line between those 2 points. 95% of the time you're tacking, which is you realize you've gotten off of that center of that straight line and you course correct. And then you overshoot it a little bit and then you course correct. And you overshoot it a little bit and course correct. And so that's not to say that that's not the case, or that people's paths or understanding of the path doesn't change or shouldn't change or anything like that. But in this age of an overabundance of spiritual traditions, an overabundance of, everyone on the internet has, not everyone, but, there's so many people, there's so many books, there's so many teachings and, oh, this type of witchcraft and that type of witchcraft and yoga and this type of yoga and this teacher, and I'll take this class and read this book. The people that really did it, the saints, the realized beings, the magi, these were people who devoted themselves absolutely to one thing. And ultimately, regardless of the language, I know this word is triggering for some people, but regardless of the language around that, the one thing is God. And how we invoke God matters. It has qualitative effects on our experience of the path. So I wish you 100%. I wish you total devotion. Thanks for hanging out with me.